Chasing Lullabies on YouTube. And let's begin. Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Chasing Lullabies, where we try and chase away the lullabies, where we try and engage in a more wholesome, complete way with the text, with the parsha, and don't simply read a story as we've always read it, but rather we try and think about it in a more whole way, in a more complete way, asking the questions that really need to be asked in order to access the text in a deeper manner. So let's begin this week, and maybe to introduce it, I thought a nice sort of way in to asking the difficult questions on this week's Torah portion. By the way, this week is a double parsha. It is Chukat and Balak together. So even though it is a double parsha, we're only going to be focusing on the first parsha, which is the parsha of Chukas. And yeah, I thought, so the way to introduce it is that when we were younger, so we used to go to Israel a lot as a family, and the place that we would go is we'd go to Netanya, also known as Britannia for anyone who's been there. By the way, can you hear me okay? Can you just wave if you can hear me? Okay, fantastic. So so known as Britannia, and there were certain things that we always used to do. So we'd always go to Young Israel, also known as Old Israel, in North Netanya, and that was the shul that our apartment at the time used to be close to. Now my parents have actually moved down to South Netanya, so they don't go to Young Israel, they go to Snack, which is South Netanya Ashkenazi congregation, I think. So if ever anyone's on holiday and they're going to Snack, look out for the Landaus there. So we used to be going to North Netanya, and my grandmother lives also in Netanya, so she lives on Shlomo HaMelech Street. So Young Israel is her local shul. And then we used to go to the square. We used to go to the to get Pedro's pizza and Tony's ice cream and play in the arcade. That was kind of the thing for the boys to do as a special treat. Was the arcade pizza ice cream package, or fluffle package for those that didn't want pizza. But also my parents used to be quite involved, and still are somewhat, with Lanyardo Hospital. So that's not going down towards the square, but that's going up the other way to Kiryat Sands, to the Hasidic area where they have Lanyardo Hospital. And the story of Lanyardo Hospital is quite an amazing story, that there was a Hasidic Rebbe living in, I think, Poland, the Sansa Rebbe, and he was living in Poland at the onset of the war. And he lost everything. He lost everything in the camps. He lost his wife, he lost his children, he lost most of his followers. And he made a promise to God. He said, if you get me through this hell, then I'll go to Israel and I'll build you a hospital dedicated to life. If you can get me through this place of death, I will build you a hospital dedicated to life in your holy land. And that's what he did. He got through the camps. He made it through. He rebuilt his Hasidic dynasty and group in Netanya. And he founded and built Lanyardo Hospital. I think there's a famous story, and I think it was the fateful Pesach that my parents and I and many others were in Netanya. And that Pesach, it was a very strange Pesach, because we were our balcony, our Pesach, looked out towards the main coastal road, and all night, that same night, there were ambulances going up and down the coastal road, and we didn't know what had happened. And then my dad and I took a walk after we'd finished Chad Gadya, after we finished our Seder, and we walked past the Park Hotel, and just the entire place blown apart. Imagine you're the Sons of Rov, and imagine you've made that promise, and that you have got to the land of Israel, you've survived the camps, and you've started the work on building the hospital. You've collected the funds, you've gone around, you've gone to America, you've gone to England, you've gone collecting from all different wealthy people that might support, donors that might support your project, and you started to build this hospital. And just before the hospital has actually started to become the place that it is, this incredible place of research and of care, you fall ill and you die. And you never get to see your dream. You never get to see the fulfillment of your life's work, this place of healing in the land of Israel, because unfortunately you've passed away before it came to pass. Imagine the indignity, imagine the injustice. Okay, so we go to this week's parsha, and we have the greatest leader of the Jewish people that ever was, Moses. And we have probably the greatest project, the greatest plan, to take a slave nation, to take them away from their captors from bondage, to take them through the desert and to bring them to the Holy Land, to bring them to a land which is flowing with milk and honey, a land which they can call their own. And that is your project. And imagine the injustice of not being able to see that come to fruition, of not being able to see that come to pass. It's like the Sansa Rebbe example on steroids. He got to see his hospital. He actually went in that night, I think, of the Park Hotel, and he went in personally into the hospital and he turned on the lights. You know, everyone has to get involved with saving life. Doesn't matter, it's Yom Tov, it doesn't matter. Let's go. We have to look after everyone that comes in. But that's not what happens to Moshe. He doesn't get into the land of Israel. And why does he not get into the land of Israel? What is this egregious error that forces him, that stops him from being able to enter the land? It's because in this week's parasha, the children of Israel are once again crying out for water. And God says, provide them with water, speak to the rock. And rather than speak to the rock, he strikes the rock. And that has made all the difference. Striking the rock, nevertheless, it did bring forth water. It did. But it was the wrong, seemingly apparently, the wrong thing to do. And so he can't go into the land of Israel. Okay, so that's the story. What are the questions we have on this story? How can we open up tonight's session by picking apart, asking the questions that need to be asked here? Yes.
Rabbi, he struck the rock before and got water.
Great.
So why does it make, you probably thought, well, I did it before and I was all right.
Right. So let's take that question. He's already struck the rock. And or we could ask it slightly differently. Is it miraculous to take a staff, hit a rock, and for that rock to then produce water? Is that miraculous? Yes or no? What do you think? Yes, it's miraculous. Yes, that's pretty miraculous. I think that's amazing for a rock to produce water. So he's done that before. God has asked him in the past to strike the rock. He struck the rock. Is poured forth with water. That's pretty amazing. So what is the big deal? What is the incredible difference, the massive difference between speaking to a rock and striking a rock that he's already done before, that if I strike the rock and produce a miracle, that is condemning me to stay and die in the desert on Mount Nebo. Whereas opposed to speak to it, that means that I am still the right leader of the Jewish people. I can still take them through into the promised land. Okay, so good. First question, what's the difference between speaking and striking? Any other questions? Dolly?
Yeah, the difference is you didn't follow your instructions. One was strike, one was speak.
Okay, so I hear you, Solly. I don't want to get into answers yet. I want to get into questions, but I'm going to counter you with the question.
So what's the difference between striking and here is your question?
That's the question, but I'm going to counter you. You said he didn't do what he was told. Okay. Granted, he was told. Granted, I agree. He was told to speak and he didn't. He struck. But let me ask you, is that a fair response? Is it a fair punishment for a small, seemingly a very small infringement? He did a miracle. He provided them with water. Yes, he did. He struck and he didn't speak. But that means he loses the leadership of the Jewish people. That means he can't go into the land of Israel. Is that fair? Is that a fair punishment? Is that punishment commensurate with the crime?
I think it's a very harsh punishment.
Right, it's very harsh, seemingly. How are we meant to understand how harsh it is?
Because it was Moshe that he was speaking to, not anybody else.
Okay. Okay, so Harvey's saying, well, we hold our leaders to a higher account, a higher standard than we than other people. I take that on board, but I still think that we need to understand how does one crime, the crime of striking rather than speaking, how does that meet the outcome of not being the leader of the Jewish people anymore? We have to think. Okay, any other questions? Russell?
Does that presuppose that there needs to be a connection between the punishment and the crime? I mean, was this potentially a one-off? So does it need to be a precedent?
I think that's. I don't think there's a precedent for the crime fitting the Sorry, I don't think there's a precedent for this particular punishment fitting this particular crime. This is a unique situation, but I think that in general, if God is a just God, then his punishments have to be commensurate with the crimes. So, for example, if in Judaism we don't offer the capital punishment for a minor sort of relatively minor crime such as thievery. You know, so we are normally, if for example, if you steal something, then you have to repay what you stole, and you might pay a fine on top of that as a punishment. But that doesn't. That is where you see that the punishment seems to fit the crime. If a person puts someone else to death, then there might be a death penalty in certain situations. Again, it's commensurate. But here,
commensurate from whose perspective?
Well, don't we understand that there has to be a system of justice that we can wrap our heads around? I recognize that we could say it's all God's plan, but normally in terms of balance, we talk about measure for measure. That measure has to be something that we can also wrap our heads around normally. Otherwise, we have to sacrifice all thinking and just say it's all God, which is like fair enough, but that's not that. And sometimes we have to say I can't understand, but at least we should ask the question. Even if we're going to say maybe we can't wrap our head around it, it's God's sort of accounting. And as an accountant, we wouldn't want to be God's accountant, right? So that's certainly the case. But I think we have to ask, what was the accounting here? Okay, so two questions, I think primary questions so far. What's the main difference between striking and speaking? Second question is, how does the punishment fit the crime? And my third question would be a question of context, almost, which is, what was going on for Moshe? What happened here? I'm interested in learning from what had happened to bring Moshe to this point that he made this error. So one is about the error itself, but the other question is about why Moshe? What happened for you?
Is there something else about where he's getting to the end of his tether, really? Because he's had so many situations where the Jewish people had just said, that's enough, we want to go back to Egypt. And he's thinking, this is not the fifth or the sixth time. And I'm thinking, my God, he's thinking, what's going on here? And also thinking about it, if it's sort of the leader, the CEO, if you like, and Hashem's the chairman, and he's thinking, well, hang on a minute, is he doing his job as I need him to do? And perhaps there's a bit of uncertainty as whether Moshe is really fit for the job.
Okay, so let's take that idea and we'll park it for a second. But Jeff's suggesting one. It could be that this was the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. So Moshe has just reached the end of his tether. So we could say that, but I would also like to know, was there any further aggravating context that made this the point where it was the straw that broke the camel's back? Was it simply just an accumulation of circumstances, or was there something now that happened? And I also appreciate this question about the CEO versus the chairman. And we do live in a society where when a CEO makes an error, they have to resign. I think that's a very interesting world we live in, where mistakes are not allowed. That there's this image of perfection, and we will talk about that at the end of today's session, because I think that is a very important question or thought about leadership. Can a leader lead with imperfection? So let's hold that.
Rabbi,
we're 20 past 8, so I want to begin some investigations also. So can we park any more questions? Is that all right? And then we'll.
Yeah, one more. I think it was the most dignified way of Moshe making his final exit, because the people were going into a new land. They needed a new leader. And I won't call it a pretext of demoting him or ending his life, but it was the most dignified way of him making his final
Why do they need a new leader, Sonny? He's the greatest leader we've ever had. Moshe, Rabbeinu, why can't he take them into the promised land?
How long do you want him to live for? He was 120.
Okay, but he was quite vigorous still towards the end.
You know,
He could have gone in, he could have brought them into the land.
I think
he could have let them rest there.
It needed a deputy. It needed somebody to take over the mantle.
Okay. So let's start the investigation. So the truth is that Hashem himself does offer an insight, it seems, into why Moshe is excluded. So if I can call up, 1 second, I'm going to call up the text for us to look at. Okay, here we are. So here is the account of Moshe. Once again, I want to thank Aleph Beta for a lot of the content for tonight. And this is the account of Moshe hitting the rock and all the different backwards and forwards. I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but I'm going to read through the denouement of this chapter, of this part. Vayomer Hashem al Moshe, we're in verse 12. Ve'el Aaron. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, Yan lohem antem bi. Since you did not have faith in me, lahagdisheni le'enei bnei Israel, to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel. Therefore, you shall not bring this assembly to the land which I have given them. So somehow we're being told that you didn't have faith in me. You didn't communicate something about faith. You didn't communicate something about sanctification. There was something you had to communicate here in this exercise of speaking to the rock rather than striking the rock. And that's the first question we're going to try and analyze. What is the difference between speaking and striking? And God here seems to be saying that the difference is that you had an opportunity to sanctify me and you didn't sanctify me. Okay, how are we to understand that? So let's jump in to a commentary from Rashi, who brings it from the Medrash, and he says, "Lahak disheni, to sanctify me. For had you spoken to the rock, and it had given forth water, I would have been sanctified in the eyes of the congregation." They would have said, if this rock, which neither speaks nor hears, and does not require food, if this rock fulfills the word of God, of eternity, of infinity, how much more so should we? And you didn't communicate that. You didn't communicate that message to the children of Israel. You struck it rather than speaking to it and giving this message that even a rock that doesn't speak, doesn't hear, doesn't require food, it fulfills God's will. So all the more so should we. And you didn't produce that message. So in a nutshell, Rashi has answered the question of what's the difference between striking and speaking, because he said speaking would have communicated this message, striking doesn't communicate this message. And that was the message that needed to get through. Fine, those are the dots. The problem is that's the scaffold. The problem is that I think this Rashi has more questions at first glance than answers. What questions would you have on this Rashi? What do you find this a compelling answer, that there was a really, really important message, a message about learning something from a rock, that if you'd spoken to it, the rock would have just given forth water and would have fulfilled the will of God. So too we should fulfill the will of God. How do you feel about that message? Does that sound like a good teaching from a rock?
Sounds a bit strange for people who probably, I don't know, a few years ago said that they will do and then they will listen.
You're saying why would they need to have that lesson?
Yeah, I mean, they've already committed their faith in that sense. So it's like, why need a rock? It's kind of like,
Okay,
I mean,
that's a good
obviously,
question. That's a good point. Now, so any other questions on that? Dan, you were about to say something.
No, I was actually going to back up what Jeff said, that they've seen, ultimately the splitting of the sea, they'd seen more there than anywhere ever, even more at more there than at Mount Sinai. So to suddenly see a rock bring the water, I don't see why it would. But there is the argument of it's just, last time they had seen him strike a rock before, so this time it's maybe okay. Now you don't have to strike a rock. Maybe there's a difference in that.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
this time was many, many years later, after the 40 years in the desert, and where a generation had died, and it was in the youth or the people who hadn't sinned who were going forth, and maybe another lesson was needed to reinforce their commitment to God by showing that their leader obeyed what he was told, the same way as they in the future would have to obey what they had learned or were being taught.
okay,
It was a different generation.
So we've got a great discussion going on here about, Solly's right, that this is the next generation. We are 40 years after the first case of Moses striking the rock. We've now gone through a intense desert experience. We're on the brink of entering the land of Israel. That has been kind of one of the big shifts between last parsha and this parsha is the progression of time. So there is a question, almost a debate, do they need a lesson? What lessons do they need? Surely they already accepted the Torah. Why do they need to learn about fulfilling God's will?
Obedience.
There's something there. But just coming back to that Rashi, which is that a rock can teach us something. And what can a rock teach us? A rock can teach us to fulfill God's will. There's been a question here, do they need that lesson? But I want to ask quite in a focused way on that Rashi, what is the problem with suggesting that we can learn something from a rock? Just as a rock, you speak to it and it does God's will. So to us, you speak to us and then we do God's will. Well, what's the difference between a person and a rock? Fundamental difference, which could undermine the whole lesson.
If an inanimate object can do what is required of it, how much so somebody who has a thinking and is animate, how much so should they do what they're told?
Well, it's the other way around. It's the other way around. This is, I think,
the other way around.
This is, I think, the point here is that if a rock is an inanimate object, it has no free will, it has no choice. So if you tell it what to do and it does what it's told, that's very nice. But I'm not a rock. I'm a human being. I have desires, temptations. The rock's not tempted to transgress God's will. The rock doesn't have some sort of Yetzer horror, some inclination to do something else. Of course it does what it's told. It's part of nature. I have pulls and drives the other way. So why would I learn from a rock? Why is it if a rock does God's will, all the more so I do God's will? No, not all the more so. A rock has no choice in the matter. I've got free will. Why all the more so should I do God's will? Yeah, do you hear the question? It's like it's backwards. Was the song in the Anthony 30, Anthony 55?
Anthony Israel from Cockfosters.
Hello?
Surely, if you look at the history of these Jews coming out from Egypt, there have been so many backslidings and questions and aggravation to Moshe that he was at the end of his tether, no doubt, and that was supposed to be a lesson to them. That's where we're coming from.
Right, but you're right, but what is this lesson that he missed out on teaching them? There seems to be some powerful lesson. Rashi tells us he could have sanctified God's name. But I'm wondering, how can you have a lesson from a rock? The rock has no challenges. The rock obviously listens to God. So what is this lesson that was so crucial that he gets banned from coming into the land of Israel? A lesson that we could learn from this rock and that we missed out on. Russell.
Could it be something to do with the nature of the rock changing? So in its ordinary state, water doesn't come forth from it, but it has the capability to change.
Right.
And so it may well be in the context of what's leading up in terms of all the complaining and everything, that people have the ability to effectively do teshuva and change and become better people.
Okay, so I like that, but then I would ask back, and I keep on this. I'm not being a nutnik, but I'd ask back, what's the difference then between hitting a rock and speaking to a rock? Because both of them is bringing about a change. I hit the rock, it changes, it produces water. I speak to a rock, it changes, it produces water. That should be a great change. I'm offering that message.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah. Yes. Dan and then Joe.
Sorry, was there someone else?
Go on, Dan.
Okay.
You're always interrupting me.
A couple of questions. First of all, did the children of Israel know whether he was supposed to hit it or speak to it? Or was that just something that Hashem and Moses knew about?
I think they didn't know, but that Moshe knew what he had to do.
Right, well then Rashi's first thing about saying they wouldn't know whether he did the right thing or the wrong thing by hitting
No,
it.
the point is a missed opportunity. He had an opportunity to teach something here.
So my next thing was, maybe this is just about him losing his temper.
But that's not what it says, Rashi, and that's not what God says. God says you had an opportunity to sanctify my name by teaching something about a rock, and you didn't do it. So you're right. There might be something about losing a temper, and we'll talk about the temper in the second part of this evening. But at the moment, there was that temper stopped him teaching a message. Joe,
Something to do with the fact that the hitting the rock is an action. It could be argued that Moshe himself is damaging the rock, splitting the rock, making it fissure open in some way, whereas talking to it would clearly be more of a miracle. You're not actually interacting with the rock. It must surely be God's action then.
Right. So I think this is the opening that we need to understand the difference between hitting a rock and speaking to a rock. So, and it's actually that this is a very symbolic difference between the way that we interact and understand the presence of God. So if you think
This is
about
where the saying between a rock and a hard place come in.
You're putting me into it, yeah. Thank you, Solly. So we're gonna just kind of now put together some of these pieces that we've been discussing. If there's an external force acting upon something, it's a way of understanding God that is relatively simple, in the sense that when I think about this, like there's two ways to think about God. I'll start again. There's two ways to think about God. The first way is that there's this force called God, and every so often he interacts, he gets involved with this world. The way I think about it is like the Sistine Chapel. You've got that image of God reaching out and man sort of reaching back, and then they sort of meet in the middle. So that actually is a very interesting minimizing of God. God's like out there, and then we're down here, and every so often God gets involved in our world. And that's like, and this force called Moshe striking a rock, and then our world responds in kind. If you think about it from the rock's perspective, it's like I'm being forced to do God's will. I'm being coerced. There's me, I'm a rock, I'm minding my own business, and one day I get this almighty whack on my head. And yeah, okay, I'll produce water because God's asked me to do that, and that seems like a relatively, meaningful thing to do. But I suppose I didn't have any say in the matter. This isn't about my essence pouring forth water. I've just been smacked on their head. God's got involved, and so of course I have to respond. Now, so we asked, surely the Jews accepted the Torah. Surely they already accepted the Torah. So what was lacking in their acceptance? As Jeff said, they said Na'aseh v'nishma. But Jeff will know from Daf Yomi that there is an interesting medrash, an interesting story surrounding the acceptance of the Torah that we learned in the tractate that we're dealing with at the moment. And this medrash reads like this. Medrash reads over here in Masechet Shabbat 88a. It says, the Torah says, and they stood, Vayisyatzu v'tachtis hahar. They stood underneath the mountain. Rabbi Avdima Bar Chama Bar Chassa said the Jewish people actually stood underneath the mountain. And the verse teaches that God overturned the mountain above the Jews like a barrel, like a big rock. And he said to them, if you accept the Torah, that's great. And if not, I'm going to drop you. I'm going to break you. I'm going to drop this piece, this Torah, this mountain on top of you. And this understands that somehow the Jews were coerced into accepting the Torah at the time of Mount Sinai. Now, I don't think you're meant to take this medrash literally. I don't think we're meant to understand that God literally picked up a mountain. Right? I've got my mission, my Shulchan Aruch over here. It's not like God picked up the mountain and said, "Listen, guys, if you don't accept it, you're squished meat." I don't think he said that, but I think the answer is like this: imagine going through the splitting of the sea, the 10 plagues. You've heard God's voice at Sinai. Imagine going through all those experiences where you see God constantly interacting with you. He's like constantly smashing you on the head, miracle after miracle, plague after plague. There's just godliness everywhere. Do you have any choice to say, no, I don't want the Torah? Is there any way to walk away? Is there any to walk away from what you're seeing? You can't. There's nothing you can do but say, Na'aseh v'nishma. Yeah, we'll take it. We'll take it. Why? Because it's so obvious that God exists. There's no free will anymore. There's no. And so it's a way of relating to God, almost where God's hitting you on the head out from outside and saying, now respond. And you have to respond. It's like the rock. I'm being bashed. I must produce water. But there's another way to think about God relating to this world. And it's not that there's some external agent out there which I must respond to, which I'm almost forced to respond to. There is a presence of God within all things. A sense of godliness within me, within the rocks, within the trees, within all of nature. Not supernature, not miracles, but God's right here, right now, with me in this rock. And that's the message which is a more refined message, an incredibly powerful message. It's a message that says I can just speak to a rock, and of course it will pour forth water, because nature resonates with the will of creation. If I'm going to get a little bit kind of physics-wise and maybe a bit deeper on this one, you might ask like this. There are natural forces in the world. There's gravity, there's electromagnetism, there's strong nuclear forces, there's weak nuclear forces. What makes a rock observe the laws of gravity? Why does a rock have to fall down when it's raised up? Why does this book have to fall on the table when I drop it? Why should the book listen to the laws of gravity? Why should it listen to God, so to speak? And the answer is existence is abiding by a set of principles. Existence, nature is because it's all part of the will of God. Everything does its job because it's part of the greater plan. And so if I tell a rock that its plan, its mission right now is to produce water, and it is resonating with the will of God that exists in all of creation, so of course it produces water. Not because there's something out there that needs to be responded to, but because there's something in here that exists in line with its creator. And so I'll take your question in a second, Solly. And so the mission that Moshe had was to transition the Jewish people from one way of relating to God to the next. Why? Because they're moving from a supernatural existence in the desert, when they've been having the bread of God raining down upon them, when they've been having all their needs met, when they've been having a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, when they've been having the Mishkan traveling in their midst. They've been living a supernatural existence, and they're about to go into the land of Israel, where it's just rocks, it's trees, it's sand, it's stone. That's all there is. But they need to know that actually that's not all there is. That's where God is found. He's found in nature. If you were to do a little sort of thought experiment on this one, just close your eyes and imagine being in a scene of nature. Maybe it's a beautiful glade. Maybe it's by the sea with beautiful sparkling blue waters. Imagine being in nature, that sense of what it's like. And notice what it's like when you feel at one with something. You feel at one with creation. You feel at one with with your creator. You feel at one with yourself. It's that sense of being part of the bigger plan, the bigger picture. If you speak to a rock, it gives forth water. Now, actually, the verses say this. The verses, when it talks about way back when about striking the rock, it says the rock is struck and it out pops water. Whereas when it talks about speaking to the rock, it says speak to the rock and it will give of its water. When one is in nature, when one is in that sense of being part of something bigger, one sees God all around. And that is the message that they needed to learn. And God says to Moshe, you didn't believe in me enough to sanctify me, to teach. That just as a rock which doesn't need sustenance, which has no higher capacity for thought, it does God's will because it resonates with creation, it resonates with infinity, it resonates with what it means to be part of God's will. So too we should find that resonance, that moment of stillness, of oneness. And so therefore we should also spill forth with the goodness that he's commanded. And that's the mission. That's the difference between striking a rock and speaking to a rock.
Yeah, Rabbi.
And the message that was missed. Sorry.
Is this the first time that Moshe exercised his free will? Or that people previously were told to do what they had to do, and when they didn't, they were sorely punished? Now that they were going into a new world, is this where free will just enters, where free will was not sorely punished previously, where you had to obey, and subsequently your free will, if you made the wrong choice, you will be eventually punished after you meet God again one day?
So I'm going to take your question and I'll just answer it as
I've gone quiet.
moving on to the next part, because your question essentially is okay. So maybe the issue here is that free will was executed, and so he gets punished. But again, why does the punishment fit the crime? So we've answered question one. Question one is, what's the difference between striking and speaking? There's this beautiful message that Moshe missed out on, a message that they needed for coming into the land of Israel. Question two was, okay, so he missed out on that message, but why does that mean that he doesn't get to go into the land of Israel with them? And question three was, what's going on for Moshe right now, that this is the point that it's the straw that breaks the camel's back? And it's here that we're going to get to another level of depth in our understanding of this story. We're going to peel away another layer in understanding what happened here. And hopefully, we'll link this back to what happened last week and learn a little bit more about what it means to be a leader. So with all that in mind, let's go back to the verses right at the beginning of this story, and just notice something which seems like a inappropriate introduction to the story. It says over here, the entire congregation of the children of Israel arrived at the desert of Sin in the first month, and the people settled in Kadesh. Miriam died there and was buried there. So Miriam dies. V'lo haya mayim le'eda, and there was no water to the congregation. Vayikalu al Moshe ve'Aaron, and they argue, they quarrel, so they assembled against Moshe and Aaron. And then we get into the issue that you've brought us here to die. The water's gone, and we're all going to perish from dehydration in the desert. Why don't we start at verse 2? Start at verse 2. There wasn't any water. What does verse 1 have to do with what happens next? Okay, what does verse 1 have to do with what happens next? It seems like there's the Miriam's death. Seems like Miriam's death has the loy. After we talk about Miriam's death in verse 1, and then there's a vav, and there was no water to the congregation. She died, and there was no water to the congregation. That vav, that conjunction at the beginning of verse 2, seems to be telling us that Miriam's death, on the one hand, led directly to the lack of water on the other hand.
Because she carried the well with her.
The well of Miriam.
Right. So many of you know that famously, Miriam's merit brought along a well. But before we analyze, we jump straight into that. Let's just pull back the zoom lens for a second and say, wow, there's something here about Miriam and water. One second, how many times have the Jews struggled for water in the desert? This actually isn't the first time. It's not the second time. This is the third time in the story of the Jewish people going through the desert that they have struggled with water. What was the first time? What was the first time?
The waters of Mara.
Okay, Soli. So Soli said the waters of Mara. So that's right, that after the Jewish people have gone through the splitting of the sea, they've triumphantly come through, the Egyptian hordes have drowned behind them, and then they travel for a few days, about 3 days, because that's about the time that it takes for people to get entirely dehydrated. And they get to the waters of Mara, the waters of Mara. Mara means bitter. And they couldn't drink the waters. They complain against Moshe. Moshe throws some bark into the water. They become sweetened and everything's okay. What's the next water crisis? Well, crisis number 1 was the bitter waters. What's crisis number 2? Anyone? Well, crisis number 3 is this week's parasha where Moses speaks to the rock. So crisis number 2 was where Moshe was after the waters of Mara, another 3 days or so, they'd run out of their Mara water, and now they've got another complaint against Moshe. We still have no water. And so that's the time that Moshe strikes the rock and out comes the water. Crisis number 3, 40 years later, Miriam dies and there's no water again. So now we have to wonder. Crisis number 1 at the beginning, about 3 days after they split the sea. That makes sense. It takes about 3 days for people to get fully dehydrated. Crisis number 2, another 3 days later or so. Makes sense. They've it's split. It makes sense. They've run out of water. They're going to get dehydrated, and so they need water again. Moshe strikes the rock and produces water. Okay, 40 years later, crisis number 3. What happened for 40 years? Why is there no water crisis from crisis 2 to crisis 3? What happened in the intervening time? So many of you just said, well, that was Miriam. And the Medrash says, Kol arba'im shana haya lehem ha'be'er b'zchus Miriam. That for the full 40 years, they had a well in the merit of Miriam. And that's the answer to why there were no water crises between crisis number 2 and crisis number 3. Because Miriam's merit caused the water to always be there. And actually, this itself is alluded to, that Moshe knew about this special merit of Miriam. It's alluded to in the verses themselves. Because let's go back to this week's parasha. And let's see what Moshe says, what Hashem says to Moshe. It says in verse 8, Kach es hamate, God says to Moses, take the staff, v'hakel es ha'eda, and gather together the congregation, Atav v'Aaron achicha, you and Aaron your brother, v'dibartem el hasela le'eineihem, and speak to el what? Speak to the rock. Definite article, ha sela, the rock le'eineihem, in front of their eyes, v'nasa meimov, and it will give forth of its water. Okay, 1 second. Ha sela, the rock. The rock, not dibatim el sela. Don't speak to a rock, speak to the rock. It sounds like there's a very special rock knocking around that Moshe is fully aware of its existence. What special rock is it? Oh, well, the only other special rock that Moshe has had a connection with was the rock that he struck in water crisis number 2 40 years ago. In water crisis number 2, he struck a rock and it started to produce water. And then for 40 years, there was water. It makes sense to say that this special rock, and this is what the Medrash tells us, this special rock traveled along with the Jewish people always giving forth water. It was opened up and it never stopped. Why did it never stop? There was a very special lady. Her name was Miriam. In her merit, there was a rock. It was producing water. It carried on, moving around with the Jewish people as they traveled through the desert from place to place. It rolled along with them, producing water. The rock that Moshe knew about. And God says, that rock, do you remember that rock? Yeah? So that rock that you remember, the one that used to continue, that was producing water in the merit of your older sister Miriam, speak to it. That one. And Moshe doesn't, and he hits it. And Miriam now seems to be a link between all of the three stories. Miriam seems to be present in water crisis number 1, water crisis number 2, and water crisis number 3. Not just, and we're going to find her presence both in the story and in the words. So let's have a little look, because this is, I think, fascinating. Where's Miriam in water crisis number 1? Well, just before water crisis number 1, what has happened? They've gone through the sea, the splitting of the sea. And who famously sings after the splitting of the sea, leading all the women in the song of the sea? Miriam. That's Miriam's presence in water crisis number 1. She has sung her song. And then they get to Marah and they're complaining for water. What about water crisis number 2? Where's Miriam's involvement? Well, the rock that was struck becomes her well. And water crisis number 3, where's Miriam's involvement? Well, she dies, and then her well dries up. Miriam seems to be there at each stage of the journey. If I was going to just show that to you graphically, so then I would take you to this share and say, just before water crisis number 1, Miriam sings her song at the sea. Just after, at the time of water crisis number 2, the rock that Moshe hits becomes Miriam's well. Just before water crisis number 3, Miriam dies and her well dries up. Okay. Now this is getting a bit spooky. It gets even better. So the Hebrew letters for Miriam are Mem, Resh, Yud, Mem. So if I'm going to draw that out, piece of paper. Excuse me. So Mem, Resh, Yud, Mem. You see that? Probably get a marker, which is better. But Mem, Resh, Yud, Mem is Miriam. Okay, Mem, Resh, Yud, Mem. Miriam, those letters, if I take away the vowelizations, I can produce 3 different words with those letters. Okay, what are those words? Those words are the following. Little screen share. Marim, right? So here's Mem, Resh, Yud, Mem. I can make that into the word marim, which means bitter. Meirim, which means to raise. And morim, which means rebels. Where do those words feature? Marim, the bitter waters. Water crisis number 1, when there's bitter waters. Meirim, to raise up. Where do we find raising up? When Moshe raises his arm to strike the rock. Morim, rebels. Where do we find that word? When Moshe calls out in this week's parsha and says, Shimuna hamorim, listen you rebels, and then he strikes the rock rather than speaking to it. So the letters of this name of Miriam appear throughout the water stories. She appears as a character. Her name appears in each of these instances. And so Miriam seems to be inextricably linked, closely linked to what's going on. And you know, Miriam's history with water goes way back. Because when do we first meet Miriam as a powerful character in the Torah? Russell?
When when Moses is put into the water after his birth.
That's right. When we first meet Miriam, she's a young girl. She has convinced her parents to get back together again and to have a child, because her father had separated himself from her mother, saying, why should we have any children? The Egyptians are committing infanticide, they're killing our babies, so we shouldn't have any children. And Miriam says back to Amram, her father, and says, you're worse than Pharaoh. Pharaoh was going to kill only the boys, you're killing the girls as well by not allowing the Jews to have children. And so Amram and Yocheved, Moshe's parents, get back together. They have a baby. His name's Moshe. Moshe's mother, Yocheved, tries to keep the baby as long as she can, but as many of you will understand, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to keep a crying baby away from the Egyptian Gestapo. And so, in an act of desperation, Moshe's mother puts this baby into a basket and lets it loose in the Nile. Now, we have the power of hindsight. It's very nice to know that that story ends well. But if you're a mother and you're trying to manage this situation, what does Yocheved think when she puts the baby in the basket? She doesn't think this is going to end well. She just can't manage to see her baby taken by the Egyptians. So this, for her, is better, but she is saying goodbye. But there's one child who believed in the power of life. A little girl called Miriam, who prayed for her parents to get back together, to have a child. This child. And she stands and she watches. And she watches. And she follows that basket to see that it actually reaches a place of safety. She stands there and she has faith. And the verse itself says, his sister, Vatitat Tsev, she stands there and she watches, and she has faith at this point of water. Miriam is introduced to us as someone who has faith at a moment of water. And that story plays itself out again later on in the Exodus story, because there's another point in the Exodus story where it seems like there's certain death at the hands of a watery grave. And now there's someone else who's standing, watching, and having faith. Because now it's not just one Egyptian that is come, or a number of Egyptians coming after one child. It's the entire might of Egypt coming after all the children of Israel. And we're talking about when the Jewish people, they've left Egypt, they're standing at the banks of the Sea of Reeds, and there's the Egyptian hordes chasing down upon them. And they don't know what to do. They're freaking out, because either they're going to drown in the waters of the Sea of Reeds, or they're going to fall at the spears and swords of the Egyptians. And there's one person who's learned a lesson from his sister to stand and to watch and have faith, even at a time where it seems like everyone has given up. And the verse says, Hityatzvu, that they stood there. Moshe says to the people, he says, don't be afraid, stand firm. The same words used to describe his sister standing and watching, standing firm, having faith. When she was watching him in the basket, he now takes that message which he's internalized and communicates that to the entire nation. Stand firm. I know that God is with us. I don't know how it's going to happen. I don't know where the salvation is going to come from at this time of water. But I know it's going to happen. And so Miriam's involvement with water, and not just her involvement with water, but her faith, produces a certain merit, a certain merit for the Jewish people. That when does that happen? That when when that first rock is hit, her merit, her faith, keeps the water flowing for 40 years. And then she dies. And the Jewish people are almost so obsessed with their loss of water, they don't even mourn for her. They don't even mourn. But there's one man that is mourning, her younger brother. And he's in the depths of grief, and now they're complaining again. And God says, you can do it, Moshe. You can once again reproduce the message, the faith of your sister. Speak to the rock, teach them that message. You can do it again, just like you did at the banks of the Sea of Reeds 40 years ago. So too now, reproduce the message of your sister. Have faith. It's going to be okay. Speak to the rock, reproduce the merit. And he doesn't. He can't. Because the grief has led to anger, and the anger has led to missing the mark. Shimuna ha-morim. Hear, O you rebels. Shimuna ha-Miriam. Listen, Miriam. I don't know what to do. I'm lost. I don't know how to bring you back. I need you. Shimuna ha-morim. But listen, you rebels. I'm so angry. It's the straw that broke the camel's back, because now at this point, I am so in pain. I don't know how to hold on to this woman that held me fast, whose merit kept us going, whose lessons I learnt, who kept me safe from when I was a child. Listen to me, Miriam. I'm angry at these rebels. I'm so angry in my grief. And so why does he lose the leadership? Because who else was angry because of grief? It was the rest of the nation, as we learnt last week. Korach and his followers were grieving, we learnt. They were grieving over their lost dreams, trying to hold on to this idea that they could still go into Israel, even after the errors that they made, and they couldn't. And the grief drove them to crazy anger. What happens when a leader falls in his level to that of a follower? He ceased to be a leader anymore. A leader is someone, not that they don't experience the same thing as their followers, not that they're not just as vulnerable and frail in the sense that they have the same challenges. A leader, of course, is faced with challenges. Moshe is faced with having to manage grief and loss, just as Korach and his followers were faced with having to manage grief and loss. The difference between a leader and a follower is not whether they have the same challenges, it's what they do with those challenges. And if the leader does the same thing and falls into the same trap as the follower, now we can't lead anymore. You had a message you could have taught, but actually the reason you didn't teach it is because you ceased to be a leader, Moshe. You become just like the followers in this moment. And so I leave us, first of all, answering the three questions. What's the difference between speaking to a rock and striking a rock? The difference is to communicate my place within nature, a place that needed to be communicated as they move into the land of Israel, that I can resonate with the will of God at every moment because it's internal. Question number two, why was this measure for measure? Why was this the response? Why was this the response to Moshe's error? It seemed like a small error. The answer is that somehow Moshe had lost his ability to be a leader because he became a follower. Why? Because this is the point that Moshe encountered grief. Moshe encountered incredible grief and couldn't give up, couldn't move on from the anger that he felt at the loss of his sister, from the grief that was driving him into a negative place as he tried to bring her back rather than live her message in the moment. But let me leave you with a small question. What is the difference between a leader and a follower? And this is something that I think we've all been dialoguing about in Barnet Shul over the past year or so. Is a leader someone who's perfect? Someone who doesn't have any challenges? Someone who doesn't face the same difficulties that everyone else faces? Or is a leader someone that takes those challenges and teaches us how to deal with them in better, in higher, in wiser ways, to bring more light into the challenges of life, to bring more skill, to bring more Torah into those moments, to see how we can resonate with the will of God, even in the challenges, even in those points of despair and darkness. That's a leader, in my opinion. And that's what we're learning here. There's so many layers to this story. Thank you for chasing away a lot of the lullabies around this story, for digging upon layer, and for joining me on this journey this week. See you next week. Any questions?
Yes, Rabbi, was